Welcome to this issue of Discovering Truth of the Movies. Hi, my name is David Lance. Today, in this episode of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar, Grandpa begins to read the story of how the Babylonians demanded that King Jehoiakim deliver those who will be going into exile into Babylon. And so we begin the story of the prophet Daniel there in Jerusalem as he's taken into exile. I'm also going to use a little information from a movie called The King's Speech, in which King George VI has to give a speech on the radio leading up to World War II, but his problem is he has a stuttering problem and he needs help. He needs to be encouraged in order to do what he knows he needs to do. Now, the Chronicles of Belteshazzar are based around the concept that's put forward in the movie The Princess Bride, in which a grandfather comes to read a book to a grandson who's stuck at home and is sick. And so the Chronicles of Belteshazzar is going to be intended for youths approximately grades 4th to 9th grade. It's the story of Daniel in Babylon as told by a grandfather to his grandsons who come to spend the weekend with their grandparents. And so what I'm asking you to consider doing is to join me. I'm putting these as a podcast onto my Discovering Truth at the Movies podcast. I'm also creating videos that will be part of a YouTube video playlist. And so as you get that information, if you go to the webpage, if you go to the YouTube channel and like it, subscribe to it, then you'll be able to get these as I update them on a regular basis. Eventually, I hope to publish this as a regular book down the road. And so today we're looking at chapter 4 of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar, in which Jehoiakim surrenders. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and read the story. Less than a minute after Grandpa had left the room, he came back in dressed as an ancient wise man. Grandpa had put on a beard, a headscarf, and royal robe like the boys seen people use to dress up as one of the three wise men for Christmas plays. Standing before them, Grandpa opened the Chronicles of Belteshazzar and began to read. In the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, the Lord God raised up a lion from the east, one Nebuchadnezzar. In that same year, King Nebuchadnezzar led Babylon at a place called Carchemish, and there defeated the Egyptians. Though he did so in the name of his god, Marduk, the king of the Babylonian gods, the god of the Hebrews, had in fact ordained his steps. Nebuchadnezzar's comings and goings were prophesied by the voice of the Lord, Jeremiah of Anathoth. Here begins the account of how the God of the universe caused the children of Israel to go in exile to the land of the Chaldeans. My name is Belteshazzar, and this is my story. The Chronicles of Belteshazzar. Sire, your presence is required at the gate of Benjamin, exclaimed a guard as he burst in on King Jehoiakim and those meeting with him. They looked at him not in surprise, but in resignation to the events unfolding outside the city walls. I am coming, replied Jehoiakim in an irritated, whining voice. Curse Jeremiah. If not for him and his incessant prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem, he would be sure of his course. But now, instead of showing his people that he, the king, was in command of the situation, he was being made to look like a groveling fool. He glanced nervously at his generals and temple priests. Was that a look of sadistic pleasure he saw in their eyes at the thought that he must face the Babylonians? He looked at the guard as he rose from the chair. I said, I'm coming, Jehoiakim snapped. Tell me, is Nebuchadnezzar at the head of their army? How many soldiers do they have? What are their demands? The guard had turned and was leading Jehoiakim and his entourage out of the palace toward the gate of Benjamin. As they strode toward the destination, the guard turned his head to speak back over his shoulder. It doesn't appear that Nebuchadnezzar is with them. They appear to have a force of about 15,000 soldiers and await your arrival to deliver their surrender terms to us. Jehoiakim walked in silence with the guard and his advisors the rest of the way to the city gates. He had received reports that Nebuchadnezzar's main army was still several days' march from Jerusalem. He clearly was coming, and those outside the city were but the vanguard of the larger invading force. He thought about their defenses. The walls of the city were 6 feet thick and 25 feet high. Since the time of King David, Jerusalem had withstood the tests of time and many adversaries. Though not impregnable, it presented no easy prey to any army wishing to sack her. But the Babylonians were different. Master builders themselves, they were well known for their ability to effectively lay siege to a city and penetrate its defenses. Jehoiakim mounted the steps leading to the guardhouse on the western side of the gate. When he looked out at the invading army, his eyes became fixed on the spectacle before him, causing him to turn white with fear. There, in a line just out of bowshot, 12 of his soldiers hung from stakes planted in the ground, killed by the Babylonians. Regaining his composure, he looked at the Babylonian representative standing under a flag of truce. He steeled himself for the confrontation. I am Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah. What is it that you seek? Babylon has defeated Egypt at Carchemish, began the messenger. As you have paid tribute to Egypt, so now you will pay tribute to Babylon. This is not all. You will send out 1,500 of your ruling class, teachers, architects, artisans. These shall be taken to Babylon and trained in our ways. If you fail to comply with our demands, we shall burn this city to the ground. You have 3 days to comply with these demands issued by Naaman, captain of the imperial guard. Resistance is futile. Jehoiakim watched as the messenger turned and led his men back into the fold of the main army. That was it. No discussion, no negotiation. Surrender or die. You cannot give in to them, King Jehoiakim, Shemaiah, one of his court prophets, said. Others' heads nodded. The Lord will not allow his temple to be destroyed. So it is written in the Torah, Pashur added. All that is needed is for you to be strong and courageous. God will overcome our enemies. Jehoiakim glared at the holy man. It wasn't their necks that were on the line. How can God protect us? Did he protect Josiah, my father, from the Egyptians? No, they killed him, and we were forced to pay tribute to them. Now an army greater than Egypt's is here, and you tell me to be strong and courageous? You are a fool. My king, we have 3 days, replied Hananiah, a rival of Jeremiah. Hananiah was one of the few prophets that Jehoiakim trusted. God may yet provide. If he does not rescue us, you can do as you see best. Jehoiakim saw a way to save face and he took it. Yes, that is what we shall do. Let us return to our chambers and pray. Long ago, Jehoiakim had learned when it was convenient to sound pious. Now was one of those times. As they walked back to the royal chambers, Jehoiakim made plans to have a list of Hebrews drawn up to hand over to the Babylonians. He smiled to himself as he thought further and realized that this was truly a blessing in disguise. With one deft move, Jehoiakim would exile most, if not all, of his potential enemies and their supporters to Babylon. He had paid tribute to Egypt, so now he would pay Babylon. In essence, no difference from an economic point of view. And thanks to the prattling of Jeremiah, he could convince the people that he was in fact doing God's will. Jehoiakim couldn't wait to draw up the list of Hebrews to be exiled. Well, that concludes the reading of chapter 3. And what I'd like to do now is to provide a personal reflection on some of the background thinking about all of this. You see, after defeating Egypt at Carchemish, Babylon began to invade the area of what we today call Palestine, conquering various nations, including Judah, and Judah's kings didn't much care for the Babylonians. As we read in Jeremiah 27, verse 3, Jehoiakim joined with several other nations there in Palestine in agreement with Egypt to try to throw off the Babylonian invaders. And so the Babylonians had become their new masters, and all those groups did not like it. Now, when I started years ago, I was listening to Chuck Swindoll on his radio program, Insight for Living, back in 1997. And during that program, he was doing a review of the Old Testament books of the Bible. And when he got to the book of Jeremiah, he mentioned that Jeremiah at this time would have been in his early 40s, and Daniel and Ezekiel would have been teenagers in their late teens. And that got me to thinking, what about some sort of a brotherhood of the scroll? Could Daniel and Ezekiel have been young disciples of an older Jeremiah? And certainly knowing that the Babylonians were going to take them into exile into Babylon, they would need to safeguard the ancient writings of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. And so a group that I call the Brotherhood of the Scroll would be dedicated to preserving those writings as the Jews went into captivity. Now, in the year 605 BC, that's an important year because three major events happened. I've already mentioned the Battle of Carchemish, and so that was fought, and Egypt beat Egypt at this place called Carchemish, which is today in what is modern Syria. It's at north of Israel, near the Euphrates River, and it would have been on a trade route that later on Marco Polo would have traveled to go on his journeys to China. And so as I wrote my novel, The Brotherhood of the Scroll, I thought about that. Also in the same year, Jeremiah would have issued a prophecy, as he does in chapter 25 of the book of Jeremiah, about how Babylon was going to take Judah into captivity for 70 years. And then finally, another event happens that year. Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon, died. And so after the Battle of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar had to return to Babylon to become king. And then a few years later, he begins the conquest of the various small nations there in Palestine, including Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. And so, in terms of this story here, one of the things I've thought about was that, in many ages, both in that time and in our time, we can see politics playing a role. So, how can political issues of our day sort of be merged with issues that would have been going on in 600 BC? Technology changes, but human nature does not. And so another thing to think about is leading up to World War II, King George VI was the King of England. Back then, the main technology to communicate with people was radio. And as Hitler and the Germans were doing things leading up to World War II, the British people needed to hear from their king, but the king had a stuttering problem. He was afraid to speak. He brought in a speech coach by the name of Lionel Logue to help him overcome his fear of speaking on the radio. And so with that help, King George VI was eventually able to give a speech to be able to rally the British against Hitler and the Germans. When I was the state director of the Indiana Christian Coalition, I was more of a policy guy, a bookworm. I didn't want to get much out in the public and give speeches and things of that nature. I was rather reluctant to do that. But one of the things that I didn't realize was that folks wanted me to do that. I was afraid I wouldn't be accepted. What I came to learn was that they expected me to stand up as a person who would speak for them. And so one of the things the Christian Coalition did was they provided voter guides to people in terms of the issues of how the various members of the Indiana legislature had voted. And we were handing those out one weekend just before Easter because the primary was going to be the following week. Well, on Good Friday, a radio talk show host in Bloomington was saying all sorts of negative things about us and handing out the voter guides, even though other political groups like the Chamber of Commerce, NARAL, which is the National Abortion Rights Action League, and other groups were doing the exact same thing. And so a friend of mine who was a member of the Christian Coalition in Bloomington called me up and asked me to please call into the radio talk show to speak on our behalf. I ended up doing that, and the radio host was polite and allowed me to talk for a full 3 minutes without interrupting me. And what I learned afterward was that after I called in, while the phone calls prior to me calling in had been against our side, all the phone calls coming in were on our side because I had given courage to other people to speak up. And so, one of the things that I learned was the importance of doing that sort of thing. And so, one of the things that I want to share with you then is a meme from the movie the King's Speech, in which the speech coach has this conversation with King George VI. King George VI says, "The nation wants to hear from me, but I can't speak." And his speech coach says, "You're the bloody king. Act like it. Find your voice." And so that's one of the things that we need to do in our day and age, to be willing to stand up and speak on behalf of people who are looking to us to defend their cause. So here's a question for reflection. Have you ever been in a situation where others were counting on you to stand up in their defense? What happened? Would you have done anything differently looking back on that? Well, um, that's it for today. I want to encourage you to think about my podcast, Discovering Truth at the Movies. And if you sign up on my webpage at wisejargon.com/at the movies, you can sign up to receive my newsletter, Conversations with the Culture, as well as some other things that I'll send you. Well, thanks so much for your time. And until next time, God bless.